There are just too many Arizona State Sun Devils to talk about for the 2023 season, so here's a best of the rest as we break them down in this edition of the Locked On Sun Devils podcast.
You are Locked On Sun Devils, your daily podcast on the Arizona State Sun Devils, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to the Locked On Sun Devils podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Richie Bradshaw, and I will be your guide for everything Arizona State Sun Devils. Special shout out to my everydayers who are here every day. And if you're not already, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for your podcast wherever you're getting them. And you can follow me on Twitter to stay in touch with all that content at RichieBrads36 and the podcast as well at LO_Sun Devils. All right. Today, we are going to be rapid firing through the best of the rest Sun Devils on this roster. We've been talking a lot of different players. We talked 4 different receivers. We talked the starting running back. We talked the starting tight end. Now we're going to talk about everybody else because let's face it, there's a lot of Sun Devils that have a potential to contribute to the team this year. I don't believe that it's going to be just the guys we've talked about. I do think that you're going to get a healthy amount of some of the other players as well. And when you look at this team, there's so many guys that could factor into the future of the program, 2024, 2025, that we'll get to them eventually for, their own podcasts. But for right now, I still think it's very important to talk about these guys and understand that they're going to be making an impact in their first year, no matter how big or small it might be. We're going to be breaking it up into running backs, receivers, and tight ends to end the show. So let's go ahead and just hop right into the running backs. There's 3 main guys to talk about here, but of course I do want to mention George Hart has been with the program for a long time, and I would love for him to get a full-time, or not a full-time, but a bigger role with the team. I just don't know that it's going to happen. These other 3 guys, though, I do think are going to have their own little niches with the program. We'll start with Tevin White, who's coming back. He is a former 4-star prospect. He's built like a pro running back. He's over 6 feet tall. He's 220 plus pounds. He runs hard. He showed off some really interesting upside as a freshman. And I think that going into year 2, he could potentially be a breakout player for you. Like, if you don't get what you're looking for out of Cameron Scadaboo, you could look at Tevin White to live up to the potential that he had as a high school prospect. And that idea is so interesting to me. If he is able to reach that kind of upside that he has, he looked like a player who could be a massive difference maker on the football field. Now, everything else that he has, we haven't really gotten the chance to see yet. Like, it is entirely potential here. I don't know if he's a great pass catcher or if that's going to take some time. I don't know if this is going to be a dude who gets into the end zone a lot. I do know that he does look like a very talented running back in the very, very minuscule amount that we've had. And obviously he's a highly touted kid for a reason, coming out of high school, the 4-star prospect. So I think that he could potentially be a breakout player this year, but who knows? That might be down the road in the future just because there is so much that's going on at the position. Worth noting, though, DeCarlos Brooks, another player that I want to talk about, transferring in from Cal. He does have a little bit more experience than Tevin White and Javen Jacobs, who we'll talk about here in just a moment. He's definitely coming in as the number 2 running back. And I have in my notes here that he could potentially be the Daniel Nagata to Cameron Scadaboo's ex-Valade. He could be the Chip Trayanum to Scadaboo's Rashad White. Like, I think that he could be that thunder to the lightning that Scadaboo is, or honestly, it's probably going to be thunder and thunder. But nonetheless, I do think that this is going to be a program that's going to have a lot of guys that are running the football. And Scadaboo could be one of the dudes who ends up getting not Scadaboo. Brooks is going to be one of the dudes who could end up being like that number 2 running back for the team. That role is definitely up for grabs. And while I do think Tevin White could get that opportunity, it's just hard to ignore that DeCarlos Brooks already has experience as a Power 5 running back, and he's got a little bit of production to go with it as well. He's definitely someone to monitor and keep an eye on for the team. And of course, like I said, the last guy I want to mention, Javen Jacobs. So Jacobs is very interesting because Jacobs is translating from the wide receiver spot to the running back spot. This is going to be his first year as a running back for the team. But I don't know how much I see him running the football. What I do see is him catching the football a lot. This is a dude that just looks so similar to DJ Foster. And they could potentially be one and the same this year. Again, I don't know if Javen Jacobs is going to get 30 to 50 carries this year. I don't even know if he'll get 10 to 20. But what I do think is he's going to be used out of the backfield a lot as a pass catcher because there's just a surplus of talent at the receiver position that we'll talk about here momentarily, that you're just going to want to get him involved on the offense. And getting him out of the backfield to be able to run some routes and get the ball to him underneath is going to be very important to the Sun Devils team. And I think that his pass catching prowess could really help him stand out for the team in 2023. I do believe that there is a significant role here that is up for grabs for Javen Jacobs if he is able to succeed and get that role for himself. It's definitely going to be up to him to be able to, earn that role. It's not going to be given to him. It's not going to be granted to him just because he is probably the best pass catching running back on this roster right now. He's still going to have to earn it. He's still going to have to prove that he does deserve a significant role on this offense. But nonetheless, it's really difficult to just sit here and believe that this isn't a dude who can not get involved in the offense. It feels like it's going to happen. So that's where I stand on the running backs. I feel like DeCarlos Brooks is probably a running back too. I think Devin White could be a breakout guy. I think Javen Jacobs could be a really important pass catcher for the team. I wouldn't be surprised if he led the running backs in receptions personally. And then of course with George Hart, we'll just kind of be in wait and see mode with him. It's just so difficult to try and get any kind of significant playing time in this backfield right now. If you have not already, take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. So you can bet just $20 and you'll land yourself $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting on everything from the money line to over/under to who you think is going to hit the first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Thanks as always for tuning in, guys. Wherever you're getting your podcast, hit like, subscribe, turn on those notifications. Make sure you tune in next week because next week we're going to be looking at the quarterbacks. We're going to be breaking them down individually, predicting their stats if they were to start for the whole season. We'll, of course, be starting with Trenton Bourguet. So make sure that you guys tune in next week as we break down Trenton Bourguet, Drew Pine, and Jaden Rashada. Looking at the wide receiver spot, there's a lot of guys, man. We already talked about 4, and I've got 6 more guys listed here, and that's still not even all of them. But we'll go ahead and start with the biggest name that is returning from last year's team, and that's Andre Johnson. Johnson has not been able to find himself a consistent role in the offense, and I don't know if I fully put that on him because there is just so much turnover at the quarterback spot that it's been difficult for anybody to really stand out at the receiver position outside of Elijah Badger. It took Giovanni Sanders breaking out this past season. Prior to that, you had Ricky Pearsall, but there hasn't been enough standout players at the position yet. And Andre Johnson has a lot of potential. He is a really big dude at 6'3", who is used as a field stretcher right now for the team. He's somebody that can go down the field and win those 50-50 balls. He is a lot quicker than people realize, so he can stretch the field. I'm curious if he can get that role as a deep threat, but I also am still curious, is this still the number 3 wide receiver on the team? Like, I don't know that we're going to roll into camp with a guaranteed, like, what's his name? Xavier Guillory being the other receiver on the outside. Like, Badger's the number 1 receiver. I still think Giovanni is probably the number 2. He just plays in the slot. But with Guillory there, I've talked about him a lot. I really like Guillory to be the number 2 receiver here, or number 3. I guess in this scenario, he'd be the number 3 behind Sanders. I also really like Jordan Heisen. I talked about both of them on separate podcasts. If you haven't checked those out, check them out. But we can't just dismiss Andre Johnson on this team. He's been with the program his entire career as a redshirt senior, and he's been an important factor of the offense. He could still, in theory, be the number 3 receiver on this team. We can't just rule him out entirely just because the other guys are exciting. You know, there could be some loyalty to him, or there could just be the factor that he's more experienced with this team and with the guys who were throwing him the football, that it could work out that way. I'm not saying it is, because at the end of the day, there's a reason I talked about Guillory and Tyson before I talked about Andre Johnson, but I don't want to rule it out entirely. There is that chance that Andre Johnson could still be a very important factor of the Sun Devils offense this year. So that's why I still think that he could potentially be the wide receiver 3, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Next guy I want to talk about is Mel Constable, transferring in from Colorado State. He is a very interesting player because he's definitely a slot receiver. He's a smaller dude. He's under 5'10", and he feels like somebody that you want to get the ball to like early and see if he can create something after the catch. He could be a high volume guy in some offenses, but the problem is there's just so many players here that I don't know how realistic it is that Stovall is going to get a ton of volume with the Sun Devils. Nonetheless, he's probably the secondary slot receiver after Giovanni Sanders. I would imagine that Stovall is probably that next guy after him. But we look at Cameron Johnson last year, who I was very big on for the team, who wasn't able to get onto the field enough because the Sun Devils didn't really rotate their slot receivers enough. It was really a lot of Giovanni Sanders, and we saw Cameron Johnson occasionally, but not enough, which is one of the reasons why he left the program, is because he wanted a bigger full-time role with another program. I'm curious what Stovall is going to be looking at here. He wouldn't have transferred to the program if he felt that this was going to be a similar situation to last year, where Giovanni Sanders, just an example, is like on the field for 80% of the slot snaps, and then Cameron Johnson only gets 20. I don't know that Stovall would have transferred to the program if he's going to be facing that same situation. So it will be interesting to see how they get him involved. Troy Omer, a lot of upside here. Someone I'm excited about for 2024, for sure. You look at Omer, and he just fits the bill of a top tier receiver. He just he had a very mixed spring. I feel like he stood out quite a bit in practice, but then during the game, he had a drop that led to an interception. I think he had a second drop. He wasn't able to stand out the way that he had stood out in practice, which is why I think this is going to be a quote unquote redshirt year for him, as he kind of gets acquainted to the offense and they develop him and bring him along a little bit. He's really interesting to me, though. If he is able to live up to his hype, he's going to be a dude who's just really difficult to keep him off of the football field. I'm excited for Troy Omer. I'm really hoping that he's able to develop throughout the year and potentially be that fourth receiver if like Jordan Tyson doesn't become that guy, kind of thing. Like, he is right there for me to talk about. And I had thought about doing a podcast on him. The only reason I didn't was because I had talked about 4 receivers and I didn't want to do 5. That would have been overkill at that point. But I do want to go on record that I really like Troy Omer. And I'm hoping that this is a dude that by the end of the year, you struggle to keep him off the football field. Jake Smith, really interesting. I think he has to sit out this year for transfer. I am not 100%. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. But if he does get to play, this is a former 4-star recruit. This is a dude who was a very highly touted prospect in Arizona. He's a Valley kid. He's part of the movement that Kenny Dillingham has started with the bringing Arizona kids home and the hashtag activate the Valley. He is one of the poster boys that the Sun Devils have for what's going on there right now. So it'll be really interesting to see how they get him involved. He hasn't had too big of a role so far during his college career at USC and at Texas. Part of that is just not been health has been his enemy. The other part of it is just struggling to get onto the football field. I'm not sure how it's going to work out. I thought he looked good during spring practice. Absolutely rooting and hoping for him to be able to earn a bigger role with the team. Last guys to mention is just Corbin Hendricks and Caleb Black. Really intriguing freshmen. I have no idea how the freshmen are going to get involved with so many other receivers. At this point, there's 8 guys that are more than likely ahead of them. I don't know how big a role Corbin Hendricks and Caleb Black are going to have in their freshman years for the program. If they're really good, then obviously I'm here for it. But I just don't think you can what's the word? Like responsibly give them expectations. I think that they're guys that you need to understand are going to need some time to develop and get their roles with the offense. It's not their fault at all. It's just so many different receivers on this team that are going to have solidified roles, plus other guys that are really intriguing and have high upside for the team. It wouldn't be fair to assign them roles, but for what it's worth, monitor them. See if Corbin Hendricks and Caleb Black can get onto the field maybe a little more consistently than we might realize. See what they do, evaluate them for the future. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. Wherever you get your podcast, hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tune in next week as we break down Trenton Bourget, Drew Pine, and Jaden Rashada. Predict their stats if they were to start for a whole season. Make sure you tune in for that one. Let's round it out with the tight ends. There are 4 tight ends on the roster, including Ryan Morgan, who I feel is probably going to be probably in that H-back kind of role for the team, just to find a way to get him on the field. The main guys to talk about are the other 2, which is Messiah Swinson and Bryce Pierre. Now, going into last year, there was some thought and groupthink that Messiah Swinson was going to be the number 1 tight end for this team. This 6'8" target transferring from Mizzou. He was very interesting, and he is obviously an athletic specimen at the position. There was a lot of groupthink that he was going to be the number 1 tight end. And for a little while, ASU didn't really have a number 1 tight end until Jalen Conyers took off in the second half of the season. Now he is coming in, and he might not be the number 2 tight end here because of the way Bryce Pierre has stood out, but we'll talk about him in just a second. But nonetheless, Messiah Swinson at 6'8", it would not be in the best interest of the Sun Devils to leave him on the sidelines when you get inside the 20, inside the red zone, maybe even closer to that. This is a player that feels like somebody who could potentially be that post up guy to get the football in the red zone. I'm not saying this is a 10 touchdown guy. I'm not even saying this is a 5 touchdown guy, but he could really find a role inside that part of the field for the Sun Devils and just be that jump ball guy. Because there's almost no safeties or corners that are going to be able to match up with him. There's not very many linebackers that are going to be able to match up with him. You don't see very many 6'8" defensive players that aren't defensive linemen. And even then, we don't see very many of those guys. Swinson, very interesting to me. Will depend how the Sun Devils want to incorporate him on the offense. If it were up to me, he'd be a red zone machine for this team and probably one of the more important guys for this depth chart. But of course, I do want to talk about Bryce Pierre too. Bryce Pierre went into spring practice with almost no fanfare. Like, not a lot of people were talking about him, and I can understand it because he really has not had any kind of role with the Sun Devils prior to spring practice. But spring practice rolls around and Jalen Conyers looks good. Messiah Swinson looks good. But you have this kid named Bryce Pierre who also looks very, very good during the practices, to the point where we're starting this conversation of, is he in for a breakout senior year? I think he potentially could be. The way that he has looked throughout practice, the way that he is working out, the way that he is trying to get himself into the best possible situation for that breakout senior season, it's starting to get to a point where you can't really ignore it anymore. You have to realize and understand this is somebody who is doing everything in his power to be able to show off that he needs to be on the football field as often as possible. I look at Bryce Pierre and I see a dude who's hungry. I see a dude who is ready to become a superstar for this team. Don't get me wrong. It would take a lot for him to be the superstar that he's trying to work out to be. But Kenny Dillingham does like his tight ends. And I'm really interested to see what they're going to do. Like, is this going to be a 3 tight end set team pretty consistently? How are they going to want to rotate guys in? Because Jalen Conyers is so talented, how much are we going to see Swinson and Pierre on the field? I don't know. But the way that both of them have stood out in practice, it feels like they have to be guys that you talk about as major standouts for this team. We'll wait and see, I suppose. But bottom line is these tight ends look like players that you would really struggle to keep them off of the football field, the same way I've talked about some of the other guys as well. But who do you like from this list of players that I've talked about? There's a lot of guys. Who are some running backs you like? Who are some receivers? What do you think of the tight ends? Who do you want to see involved? Who's your sleeper breakout for the team? Let me know any of those thoughts. You can hit me up on Twitter if you want to leave a comment in the comment section. You can find me on Twitter as well at RichieBrats36 and the podcast at LO_Sun Devils. But as always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. That's all that I have for you guys on this edition of the podcast. Again, make sure that you tune in next week as we break down the 3 quarterbacks, Trenton Bourguet, Drew Pine, and Jaden Rashada. Predict their stats as if they were starters for the entirety of the 2023 season. You won't want to miss it as we round out this series. Again, thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Locked On Sun Devils podcast. And until next time, you keep it locked right here on Locked On Sun Devils.